Good morning and welcome to Sharper Iron. Spend the next hour with us studying the living and active Word of God, His two-edged sword of law and gospel, recorded for you in Holy Scripture, all about Jesus Christ, crucified, risen, and descended for you. Thanks for tuning in this morning here on KFUO, Christ for you, anytime, anywhere. I am your host, Pastor Timothy Appel of Faith Lutheran Church in Godfrey, Illinois. Sharper Iron is underwritten by Lutheran Church Extension Fund. Together in faith, LCEF helps to start, sustain, and strengthen LCMS ministries through financial and strategic partnerships. Visit lcef.org for more information. On this Friday, April 17th, we are studying Genesis chapter 47, verses 13 to 31. In today's text, Joseph continues to manage the food in the land of Egypt during the ongoing famine. To help us sharpen our faith in Christ as we study God's Word today, we have with us regular guest, Pastor David Vandercook. Pastor Vandercook serves at Bethlehem Evangelical Lutheran Church in Crawford, Nebraska, and Redeemer Evangelical Lutheran Church in Harrison, Nebraska. Pastor Vandercook, welcome back to Sharper Iron.
Good to be with you again.
As we get started today, Pastor, remind us of the context as we pick up the story here in Genesis 47.
Yeah, the whole last, third or so of the book of Genesis covers Joseph and his brothers trying to kill him / sell him into slavery, whatever, trying to get rid of him. And then his rise to power in Egypt. And that's kind of where we're at here. We're getting towards the end of the book of Genesis in general here. But at this point in time, he has interpreted the dreams of Pharaoh. And Pharaoh, as a result of that interpretation, following Joseph's own advice, put Joseph in charge of Egypt, basically, in charge of making sure that Egypt was ready for this famine that they're going through, that was preceded by 7 years of plenty, 7 years of good crops. And so they're able to, under Joseph's guidance, under his leadership, able to collect enough in order to keep Egypt fed, but also keeping the surrounding region fed as well. And we're about halfway through the famine, it seems, whenever we're getting into today's reading, maybe 3 years in, where we are looking at where they're at now and what Joseph is doing as far as seeing to it that the people of Egypt are provided for. Everybody's living there. By this time, the Israelites are there as well. Jacob has brought Joseph's brothers, along with the entire family, to live there in Egypt, really invited there by Pharaoh as well, welcomed with open arms, and allowed, as I think Pharaoh puts it, the best of the land, really, to live there in Goshen. So you've got the Israelites there, but the first portion of our reading that we're looking at today doesn't really even talk about the Israelites at all. You have to get almost to the end of it before we start talking about the Israelites again.
Yeah, that's right. This is one of those sections in this part of Genesis particularly where it seems like you zoom out to consider more of the worldwide picture as to what's going on in the land of Egypt. I find that fascinating, but also very, very helpful, the way that Moses weaves those two stories together, what you might call world history, which we have today. This is what's going on in Egypt as a whole, but then the family, or the history of this one particular family, and how those two things are woven together here in the book of Genesis, because it really is one story. The story of Genesis tells us how the Lord began to fulfill that promise of the coming Savior from Genesis 3. And sometimes it's seen in very narrow ways in this one family. We know the promise is going through them. And yet at the same time, we see how the Lord is working in all of world history to accomplish that same purpose. I think the way you see those two threads woven together here is a beautiful thing.
Well, that's true. And I think it's important to see how things that were going on in other nations in general at the same time. That's helpful for us here. But also, there are some parallels here between kind of the way that Israel ends up being run whenever God establishes it as a nation, as to what Joseph is doing here as well. The way that he governs has some similarities to the way that the Lord God sets up the government for the people of Israel as well as they go forward.
Yeah, good. So we will see those parallels as we look through the text. We are starting today in Genesis 47, verse 13. Now there was no food in all the land, for the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished by reason of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, in exchange for the grain that they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. And when the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? For our money is gone." And Joseph answered, "Give your livestock, and I will give you food in exchange for your livestock, if your money is gone." So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the herds, and the donkeys. He supplied them with food in exchange for all their livestock that year. And when that year was ended, they came to him the following year and said to him, "We will not hide from my lord that our money is all spent. The herds of livestock are my lord's. There is nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our land. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and we with our land will be servants to Pharaoh. And give us seed, that we may live and not die, and that the land may not be desolate." So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for all the Egyptians sold their fields, because the famine was severe on them. The land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he made servants of them from one end of Egypt to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh and lived on the allowance that Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they did not sell their land. Then Joseph said to the people, "Behold, I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now here is seed for you, and you shall sow the land. And at the harvest you shall give a fifth to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field, and as food for yourselves and your households, and as food for your little ones." And they said, "You have saved our lives. May it please my lord, we will be servants to Pharaoh." So Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day, that Pharaoh should have the fifth. The land of the priests alone did not become Pharaoh's. We'll pause there at verse 26 of the text. So, Pastor Vandercook, again, we get a large picture, bird's eye view here of what's going on in the land of Egypt. Probably starting, it's been 2 years into the famine when Jacob's family first came to Egypt looking for food. So we're probably, somewhere around there when this text starts?
Yeah, that's what it looks like. Yeah, about 3 years, like I said earlier, about 3 years into the famine at this point in the third year. So really in the midst of it. So, I guess kind of the way that I picture it, obviously for 7 years, Joseph had Egypt saving up for this, preparing for this whole thing. But you can also look at it from the standpoint of, obviously here in what we're reading, they're running out of food. The people are running out of food. So probably the people had their own private storage of food that they were going through, and that's now starting to run out. And so now you're getting to the point where now we've got to dig into those reserves that we've put together, to make it through the rest of this famine. And so, yeah, I mean, obviously I'm kind of speculating a little bit there. I don't know exactly what kind of storage techniques the people would have used at that point in time or were using, but I would guess that they would have some stored up, and that appears to be what has happened here. Is they've run out of their own storage, and so now they've turned to Joseph for help.
Yeah, it does seem throughout this section where there's the famine that there is other food in the land in addition to the great storehouses that are there in Egypt. Just as one example, we heard about a present that Jacob sent with his sons to Joseph before they knew exactly who he was. So they had some extra things that they still had in their land, even as they were seeking food to buy in Egypt. So it is a very severe famine, but there are some things that have been stored, but all of that is starting to run out, again, about halfway through the famine. So they turn to Joseph, and we see the deterioration on the one hand of the people and the way that this begins to enrich Pharaoh. Take us into that first step in this, where they've run out of money, and we start talking about exchanging livestock.
Yeah, that's right. First they're paying money for it, and then once they run out of money, they go back to Joseph again and say, "Hey, we have no money to buy food, and we're hungry now. We still don't have. We've run out of food again." And so because they have no money, the next step is, okay, well, what else do you have? What can we give in exchange for this? And so then the livestock come there. Now, it's interesting when you think about the fact that Pharaoh takes over, or ends up possessing the livestock of the people here, in that it's really, if somebody gives you livestock, you then have to take care of that livestock. And so, it's not, it is a gift, no doubt about it. And it does cost you something to give that up. But at the same time, part of the problem that people have is that if they don't have food for themselves, they probably don't have food for their livestock either. And so it's a matter of, hey, we can't take care of this livestock anymore. So, Pharaoh does take on some of the, I guess it's sort of like taking on debt of the people here a little bit, in that, his desire, obviously, and it seems that, Joseph's desire and Pharaoh's desire by extension is that the people are preserved. He doesn't really want to kill his own people with hunger. And so it's in the best interest of the country here to do this. So yeah, they end up turning over all their livestock to Pharaoh, which means that they're also starting to run out of, I guess, what you would call capital. They're starting to run out of capital that they can use to buy anything, because now you're down to where, the next step is going to be, we don't have land. Yeah, we've got land. That's all we have, and we've got our bodies, and that's all we have.
Right. To the logistics of the livestock, one of the commentaries that I have suggested that perhaps it's more of a mortgage type arrangement, like you might do with, what kind of like what we see with the property, such that the people don't necessarily, like, it's not all on Pharaoh and his court to take care of all these livestock, but the livestock are owned by Pharaoh and his court, even as the people continue to take care of them. Could be the logistical arrangement that's behind this.
Yeah, and on top of that too, obviously, the people are still engaged in generating their own food in a sense throughout this whole thing. You could Joseph could have just said, you need food, here's some food, and just given it to them for free. But, that's not going to motivate the people to continue to, for lack of a better term, just work. They're going to become lazy and just be like, well, the government will take care of us. We don't need to worry about doing anything. So,
Yeah. Well, let's work our way through the steps of this, and then maybe come back to talk about some of those motivations that are or aren't present, because I think there's a couple of ways you could think about this, and probably people do think about it. But before we talk about that, let's just see how it progresses. So they run out of money, then come the livestock, but then, the famine's continuing. So we're on the latter half of the famine, it's still going. The next step is the land. Talk about that step.
Yeah, the people come to Joseph again and say, in fact, they suggest this. They say, we don't have any livestock anymore. We have no more money. All we have left is our bodies and our land, as it says at the end of verse 18. And so basically they offer themselves. The people actually say, take our land, and we'll also offer ourselves up as slaves to Pharaoh in exchange for food here, because why should we die? We don't want to die. You don't want us to die. Let's make this arrangement.
Right. So that then leads to, as the text tells us, Moses records for us how basically everything in the land of Egypt, other than the exception for the priests, ends up belonging to Pharaoh. Again, talk about some of those logistics. And as Joseph establishes this as an ongoing thing, at least until the day of Moses, as it's recorded.
Yeah, well, and it's not a free for all. It's not just, okay, you guys are slaves and now we've got your land. It appears that these people still lived on their land and cared for the land, because the arrangement that was made was, you get the 4/5 thing, where 4/5 of the proceeds of the land, 4/5 of the produce of the land, the people get to keep, but 1/5 of it goes to Pharaoh. And so, they're still on their land. It would reasonably, that's the way it looks. They're still on their land. They're still taking care of it. It's just that now, in exchange for the support of the government, they're giving 1/5 of their proceeds, 1/5 of the produce of the land to the government, which I would assume is going into the storehouses to help make it through the rest of the famine. That's what it would make sense anyway, if as you're reading it.
Sure. Anything to note about the fact that there's this religious exemption that to put it in our terms, the churches are tax exempt?
Yeah. Well, and that's kind of that was kind of the way I looked at it when I read it earlier. I was like, it's almost kind of like a tax exemption for the priests here. But, the livelihood of the priests is provided for, apparently, even in the Egyptian government at that point in time. The Pharaoh would provide for that. Obviously, we don't have at least in the United States, we don't have the government providing for the church directly. We do have certain tax benefits for being in the church, that do help the church exist. But we're not, you and I are not paid by the government, and that would be pretty bad if we were really. But so apparently the priests are, Pharaoh's providing for their livelihood. Now this does of course have a parallel whenever you look at the nation of Israel going forward. How is it that the priests in Israel are provided for? Well, they're given, a portion of the sacrifice that the people make is given to the priests for their living. And the priests are given, they don't really have an inheritance the same way the rest of the tribes of Israel do. Instead, they're given portions among the rest of the tribes, just pieces of their land here and there. And so same kind of arrangement seems to be in existence here in Egypt that you see with Israel going forward.
Yeah, and Moses has that note there at the end of that section in verse 26 that Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt that stands to this day. So presumably from the time Moses wrote down the books of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, right around the time of the Exodus or thereafter during the wilderness wanderings, this is the way that it was. For at least 430 years or so from Joseph's time until Moses' time in the land of Egypt. This is the way it was. That's one of those notes you see regularly in the scriptures, that it's this way to this day from when it's written. It may not be that way today in the land of Egypt, I suppose, but it was when Moses wrote it down.
Yeah, I'm not sure what kind of system they have in Egypt right now. I didn't study that, but
yeah, I mean, it's this one, yeah,
probably not the same. Yeah, but no doubt, yeah, obviously we're talking about the permanence of this is up until the time it's written. Sure, yeah.
Well, and I suppose there's I think we'll probably talk about some of the compare and contrast from what happens here to the way things go forward in the books of Moses. But I suppose it's somewhat ironic that this is one thing from the days of Joseph that does hang on into the days of the Exodus, even when you have that Pharaoh that arises that doesn't know anything about what Joseph has done for the land of Egypt. This one thing that Joseph did do in the land of Egypt still stuck around in a somewhat ironic way, I suppose.
Yeah, for a long time, right. I mean, it is that is an interesting note to think about that we don't know where we got this law from or where we got this concept from, but this is what we do,
It's a tradition. It's,
right, yeah.
In the words of Fiddler on the Roof, yeah. That's right. You may ask, where did this come from? I don't know, but it is a tradition. And it was true in the land of Egypt. So,
I don't know why we do this, but we do it. Yeah, all right, go on.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So okay, this is the way that it is in the land of Egypt. And the way that it's recorded, I mean, it's simple enough. You can imagine this happening step by step as it goes. But I suppose one of the questions that does arise is, well, is this a positive development or a negative development? What is Joseph's motivation? What is Pharaoh's motivation in doing this? I think I even said it earlier. Over the process of these years of the famine, Pharaoh's household, his court, becomes richer while the people are poorer, presumably, and yet they say to Joseph, "You've saved our lives." So they don't see it as a negative development. How do we understand what's going on here?
Well, I think if we think about why does government exist? What's the purpose of a government, and what's their interest supposed to be? And at the most basic level, the purpose of government is to preserve the lives of its citizens. So, yeah, I mean, I guess you could look at this and say, well, one way that the lives of everybody in Egypt and everybody in Canaan could have been preserved is, let's say that Joseph sends messengers throughout the land, or Pharaoh sends messengers throughout the land of Egypt and even up into areas like Canaan and says, look, I happen to know because God revealed to me in a dream. I don't know who the God would be that Pharaoh would credit that to, but nonetheless, he could say, it's been revealed to me in a dream that we're going to have 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. So here's what all of you people need to do is you need to save up for this. You need to save up for this on your own and just be ready. Make sure you've got 7 years of food stocked up over the next 7 years. So in theory, I suppose that it could have been done that way too. But here, whether it's a matter of, Pharaoh knows better. He knows that the people aren't actually going to do that, or whether it's, it's my responsibility as the leader of this country to make sure that the people survive. Obviously, it certainly went through my head as I read this preparing for today, but it would probably go through anybody's head today, especially. Well, that sure looks like socialism. It sure looks like some form of communism where the government, and that definitely, I was thinking about that. The government having control over all the land, all the food, all of the livestock, and the people are kind of, delegated some of it to do that. Obviously, that kind of system can be abused. We've seen it abused in history again and again and again by rulers that have, come to power saying, trust me, I'm the government, I know what's best for you, and then we see the abject poverty that the people live in these countries. And obviously, it's not true that these governments have the interests of the people in mind. In this particular case, though, even though we can look at Pharaoh, who's a pagan ruler, and say, we don't believe what he believes, obviously, and we don't hold to his gods, it does appear, at least in this instance, that he is acting in the best interest of his people here. And so in that, he is, and there's not a complete dependency here on the government either. As I pointed out earlier, Joseph could have just established a system where the people come and get food for free. You don't have to do anything for it. Just, we know you need it, so come and get it. But instead, initially it's, okay, you pay for the food, we've got food that we've saved up. That's like, okay, you've run out of money. He could have at that point also said, okay, here's food for free. But no, he says, let's do the livestock thing. And then when that runs out, again, he could have said, well, here's food for free. So the people are still invested in all of this. They're still, in a sense, earning their wage, and they're still, in a sense, earning their food. And the food is still kind of possessed by them, in a sense, even if it's not directly controlled by them. So I've kind of already forgotten the question you asked, but I think really what you have here is you really truly do have a government that is trying to do what's best for its people and make sure that they survive.
Yeah, and that's essentially what we were talking about is motivation, which isn't spelled out in the text, but I do think that this text is presented to us in a positive light as it's recorded in Genesis 47, such that we need not assume or speculate a negative motivation on the part of Pharaoh and Joseph that they're just trying to make a buck off these poor people, but rather are actually trying to preserve the nation, trying to preserve what's been given them to govern. Joseph knows it's from the true God. Pharaoh, thinking as a pagan, doesn't. But in both cases, they end up doing what seems to be the right thing in regarding saving the lives of the people. And I think you're right that as we read it in our context, 2,000 years after Christ, that we can't help but think about things like socialism, communism, and maybe have some anachronistic tendencies as we read this text. You mentioned, I think, earlier that there are similarities between what Joseph does here and the way the Lord provides for his people later is when they are the nation of Israel. And maybe that's the better comparison, that if we have that in mind, we'll judge this text better and more rightly than if all we have in our mind is the abuses of communism.
Yeah, for sure. And, obviously we should also mention, you had asked, I think, too, about Joseph's motivation, all of this. It's not explicitly spelled out in this particular portion of the text, but, if you go back to when Joseph reveals himself to his brothers and, they're in shock that he's still alive. And of course, also thinking our brother's going to kill us because of what we did to him, and I mean, rightfully so. But they basically, Joseph says at that point, what you meant for evil, God is using for good. And so, what Joseph recognizes is that his rise to power and his position is there ultimately to provide for his own family, to provide for his own nation. And so in this case, when it comes to providing for the Egyptians and making sure that they have food, by extension, this is also, of course, benefiting his own family, his own nation, because they are now under the care of the Egyptians as well, living in that country. But yeah, I think we do need to move to looking at what does God do with the Israelites and how does he see to it that the people there are provided for. And there's just kind of basic principles, that.
Well, let's pick those up on the other side of the break, actually. We're about to come to a break, and rather than interrupt you, then I'll interrupt you now. So
right.
we'll take our break here on Sharper Iron. We're talking to Pastor David Vandercook this morning about Genesis 47. We'll be right back. Please stick around.
Who does Lutheran Church Extension Fund serve, you ask? It's simple. We serve Lutheran Church Missouri Synod ministries and church workers with loans and ministry services. And it's faithful Lutherans like you, church members and church workers alike, investing with LCEF that makes it possible for LCEF to serve these ministries. Learn more at lcef.org.
LCF is a nonprofit religious organization. Therefore, LCF investments are not FDIC-insured bank deposit accounts. This is not an offer to sell investments or solicitation to buy. LCF will offer and sell its securities only in states where authorized. The offer is made solely by LCF's offering circular. Investors should carefully read the offering circular, which more fully describes associated risks.
Welcome back to Sharper Iron. It is Friday, April 17th. We're studying Genesis 47, verses 13 to 31 with Pastor David Vandercook. He serves at Bethlehem Evangelical Lutheran Church in Crawford, Nebraska, and Redeemer Evangelical Lutheran Church in Harrison, Nebraska. Pastor Vandercook, prior to the break, we were about to consider some of the ways that the Lord provides for the governing of his people, Israel, later in the books of Moses, that is comparable to what Joseph does here. Get us started there.
Yeah, I don't know that and honestly, I'm kind of just off the cuff on this a little bit, but whenever you look at just the basic principles that God establishes in the nation of Israel, it's, you're responsible for seeing to it that your brother is provided for. And this is true just as at an interpersonal level. First of all, that you look out for the widow and the sojourner, the hungry, the needy, but also at a larger level, at a governmental level, I suppose. You could even say that it is the role of the nation to make sure that its citizens are well. And so, you see that provision here with what Joseph's doing, and you definitely see it carried out in the way that God establishes the law, the civil laws, even for the people of Israel.
And you think about, you used the word debt earlier as to a way to think about what's happening here in Genesis 47, and the way that, later in the history of Israel, if you have a debt for someone, one of the ways to pay that debt is what we probably should consider like indentured servitude. That's described. And that's not like, I know this is just part of our American history and the way that slavery was abused and became such a blight upon our nation that we have a hard time understanding slavery in the ancient world, I think. But that matter of being able to pay a debt in a way that was still, I would say, a dignified way. You've noted that a couple of times, the way that the people here in Genesis chapter 47 were still working and we're still very active in this role, even as everything began to belong to Pharaoh. To see the way that the Lord provided for his people in the matter of being able to pay off their debts in this way, and then the way that the grace was evident in the forgiving of those debts every 7 years, and then the year of Jubilee every 50 years, that things went back to those to whom it was given as an inheritance by the Lord. Like all of that, coming background in the books of Moses, I think helps us to see Genesis 47 in a positive light.
Yeah, definitely. And especially when you think about servitude, slavery, whatever you want to call it, bond servant, indentured, all the different types of words we use for that. The point here is that I think the people, granted, they didn't have many choices. they were hungry, they had to do something, but they were voluntarily placing themselves in this position,
Right.
because they said, this is what I got to do to survive, and it does not appear, at least here anyway. I mean, certainly there's always going to be abuses of that, no matter where you're at, and no matter what time period we're in. But it doesn't appear that there's really any type of abuse on the part of Pharaoh and Joseph, or in the future, whenever we look at the Israelites even, at least not the way it was designed. It was not supposed to be a forced thing. It was almost seen as another type of employment. You need to be employed by somebody, and this is the best shot you got right now.
Yeah. No, again, and that's where we read the text for what it says, and not let our context and the way that slavery was wrong in our context influence what's going on here. I think the voluntary nature of what happens here is very important. And also, as you noted, I think in the first part of our conversation, to see the way that certainly Joseph, and I think even Pharaoh, even though he's a pagan, recognizes that the authority that they've been given is for the good of those underneath them. That's an important point to take from this that relates to the fourth commandment: honor your father and your mother. Right? We are all placed under that authority of parents, and then by extension, those who share that authority. But then on the flip side, well, what's that authority for the parents, for the government? It is to care for those under them, not to abuse them. And I think you see a positive example of that in this text.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's the promise that comes at the end of the fourth commandment? That it may go well with you and you may live long on the earth. Well, in this case, there's a very literal connection here with that, because it's a matter of life and death for these people, and that submitting themselves to authorities here does preserve their life.
Yeah. So now there is, I would say, though, some irony to the way the story progresses yet again, that right now, as it stands in the days of Joseph, those who are, the indentured servants of Pharaoh are the Egyptians, whereas the Israelites are there by free invitation, and they have the best of the land. That's how the text is going to progress when we read it in just a moment. But there's a bit of irony as to the way things will totally get reversed. Well, I shouldn't say totally, but at least reversed for the Israelites by the time you get to the beginning of Exodus.
Oh, yeah, certainly. Well, and also just the idea that, again, this particular instance, it doesn't seem that the slavery is being abused here, and it certainly is abused in the case of the Israelites whenever we get there.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, but right now, things are quite the opposite. Joseph in his position, and that's another thing too. Joseph, as he considers those over whom he's been given authority, even though they are not of his own family, he recognizes the need to care for them, and that does also stand in stark contrast to what the Pharaoh who will come and forgets Joseph, the way that he treats those who are not of his own. Now, you did note, and I think rightly so, that Joseph recognizes the need to care for his own family. And I think that's something that we shouldn't forget in this part of Genesis, is that we are following the line of the Christ here. We're following the promise that God has made to send a Savior into the world. If that line is cut off because of starvation and a famine, then God's promise can't be kept. And so all of this does serve in that regard. As much as it's serving the whole world at this point, it is serving also the church and keeping God's promise safe.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so let's go ahead then and turn to the rest of the text, which isn't much, but it does turn our attention back more particularly to what is happening to the people of Israel who are now in the land of Egypt. This is now at verse 27 of Genesis chapter 47. Thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and they gained possessions in it and were fruitful and multiplied greatly. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147 years. And when the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, If now I have found favor in your sight, put your hand under my thigh and promise to deal kindly and truly with me. Do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. Carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burying place. He answered, I will do as you have said. And he said, Swear to me. And he swore to him. Then Israel bowed himself upon the head of his bed. And that is where our text ends for today at the end of Genesis chapter 47. So, Pastor Vandercook, as this part of the text begins, we focus once again on Israel, on Jacob, who has settled there in the land of Egypt. Although it's one of those places in Genesis where you hear that someone's about to die, but he doesn't quite die right away. There's still plenty more for Jacob to do before he actually dies. We get a bit of a summary here. Talk to us about especially about verses 27 and 28 to get us started.
Yeah, so, initially, obviously, just kind of 27 and 28 really seem like summary verses, I guess, just kind of summarizing what's going on, what's happened with Israel being there in Goshen. And, basically they prospered when they got there. Things went well for the Israelites. They did gain possessions. And also, you see that phrase that they were fruitful and multiplied, and that harkens back to, Genesis, is it 1 or 2, where God tells Adam and Eve that?
Chapter 1.
Is it 1? Yeah, I thought it was the end of 1. Yeah. But, and you get that command or that instruction there. I know some people don't really like to call it a command because it sounds like law then, but whatever. That instruction from God there to be fruitful and multiply comes up again whenever Noah and his family come off the ark. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. So you get this repeated refrain kind of what God wants from his people. And here it is again, but here it's like they actually did it, which is kind of neat. So they actually were doing what they were supposed to do. They were being fruitful. They were multiplying. Obviously, that becomes a problem. I mean, it doesn't become a problem is the wrong word. The Egyptians end up not liking the fact that the Israelites are fruitful and multiply because they're afraid of them. But this little verse here reminds us that, hey, things are going really well for the Israelites. They are able to gain possessions, probably, livestock, crops, whatever. And then also on top of that, they're also having lots of babies. This is good, and so things have gone well for them. They're prospering as a nation. And this is, part of the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham, that his descendants would be as numerous as the sands on the seashore, as the stars in the sky, things that you can't number anymore. And so, we see the fulfillment of that promise to Abraham taking place here already, even before they actually even have their own land. So
yeah, that's right. And even as they came into Egypt, we heard there were 70 who have come to Egypt, but now they start to grow into this nation. That's precisely what we're seeing is the fulfillment of God's promise, or at least the beginnings of the promise being fulfilled. And right. I think it's also striking that it's happening during a famine when the people of Egypt are suffering in the ways that were just described. The Lord is still blessing his people in the midst of all of that's going on. Much like he first called Abram and Sarai when they were too old to have babies and Sarai couldn't have babies. That's the one that he chose to give the promised child to. So now, even in the midst of this terrible famine that's just getting worse, the Lord is causing fruitfulness and multiplication among his people, which I think is a reminder that as I know what you're saying about the being fruitful and multiply. It is an instruction from God, but it is also a blessing from God that he accomplishes even in times when maybe we would try to thwart his plan. I don't think that's what's happening here. I think they are being faithful. But even in times when we wouldn't expect it, he is faithful and accomplishes that blessing for us.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, okay, so things are, again, in the midst of this famine and what's happening in the land of Egypt, Israel there in Goshen is being fruitful, multiplying greatly. It says that Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years, such that he ends up living for 147 years. Now, again, he's not going to die right away in the text. That will come a couple chapters from now. But right now, we get this. The only thing that stands out to me in verse 28, Pastor Vandercook, is that it is 17 years that he's in the land of Egypt. Joseph was 17 years old when he was first sold into slavery. So you have I don't know what to say about it other than it's there. You have 17 years that Jacob and Joseph were together at the beginning of Joseph's life, and now 17 years at the end of Jacob's life that they're together again.
Yeah.
It's just a nice parallel.
I think the other thing to note there too is obviously that there's some time that has passed, most likely between verse 26 and 27 there, because you're about 17 years into their time in Egypt versus
Right.
they were probably only 3 years or so into the famine. Well, the famine
Right.
only lasts for 4 more years after that. So we're probably 10, I don't know how many years after the famine that this is going on either. So even though, so that might be something to mention too, just about the fact that they gained possessions in the land and that they were prosperous there. They probably suffered during the famine too, but we're past the famine now at this point. So yeah.
Yeah, that's true. And you think about how much the Lord blessed Jacob, just the man, during his short time with Laban, probably about that same amount of time we're talking about here, that now the Lord is blessing all of Jacob's family. It is growing at this time.
It's an
Moses
interesting
then
parallel
does.
too. Anyway, go on. Sorry.
No, it's okay. Yeah, it's just, I mean, you see the way that the Lord repeats himself
Yeah.
in the patterns that he has in his story. So he is doing now, again, bringing forth the nation that he has promised to Abram already back in Genesis 12. All of that is beginning to come to fruition here in the land of Egypt. Now, verse 29 does take us toward that time when Jacob or Israel is about to die. He knows it, and so he begins to make preparation for that here at the end of chapter 47. It's like he's going to his pastor to talk about the funeral service. What does Jacob instruct his son at the end of our text?
Well, he's very concerned about what's going to happen when he dies. Yeah, and that's kind of the way that I termed it too whenever I was putting together some notes for today was this is like going to the sort of like going to the pastor and saying this is what I want at my funeral, as you just said. This is where I want to be buried. And I think what I take from this is just, and I think we should all take from it, is that what happens to a body after you die is actually important. It actually, we confess what we believe as Christians throughout our lives, hopefully. We're going to be confessing what we believe as Christians throughout our lives, but that confession of faith that we have extends even beyond our earthly life. Even after we take our last breath, we still have the opportunity to make a good confession. When you look at how that looks like in the modern context for a Christian, one way that would be to say to your pastor or to say to your family, or both, probably be even better, this is what I want my funeral to look like. These are the hymns that I want to be used at my funeral. These are the readings that I want. I want everybody there to know what I believe, because I want the people that survive me to believe the same thing that I believe, because I want them to be saved as well. And so I think there's that element there that needs to be drawn out, that, Jacob wants to make a good confession here about the true God, about what he believes, about what he confesses. And he wants to do that even when he's laid in the grave. And the place where he's buried does help make that confession. Because if he's buried in Egypt, I don't think it obviously doesn't mean that he's doing something evil by being buried in Egypt, but being buried in the land where God has tied his promises for his people makes an even greater confession. This is my home. This is the place where God has promised us to live. And therefore, even in death, I'm going to dwell there. So I think that'll be the first thing I look at, is just that Jacob is trying to continue to make the good confession even past his earthly life here.
Yeah, well, and I think that matches up with what we heard the Lord tell Jacob before he even left Canaan for Egypt, where the Lord said to Jacob, I am your God, I will be with you, I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again. Right? He believes that promise, and so he knows, I am about to die, but God's going to keep that promise, and so I can't be buried in Egypt. I have to be buried there, because that's what God told me that promise.
Yeah, and perhaps I think it deserves to be refuted again, just because we have the opportunity here too, that Jacob's body is him. There is kind of that idea that's floated around for years in Christianity, even, that whenever the person dies, the body isn't actually, that's not them anymore. No, it is still them. That is still their body. That is the body that God is going to raise from the dead on the last day. And so, yeah, whenever they carry Jacob And you read about it toward the end of Genesis here. They actually go to great lengths to get Jacob's body back to Israel to bury it. Whenever that happens, sorry, I lost my train of thought. So they do that in order to, again, confess that this is our home, this is where we're taking him. Oh, that this is still Jacob. They're still burying their father there. It's not that we're taking this lifeless corpse that we don't know what it is anymore. It's just leftover carbon matter, and we're going to go put it in the ground somewhere. No, this is our father. This is Jacob. So anyway, it just makes, again, the confession that God creates us body and soul, and the body is part of his creation, and it is redeemed by Christ as well.
Well, and then just to finish that train of thought that you started there, all of this means that the resurrection of the dead is a reality as well. The resurrection of the body. That if that's Jacob and he needs to be buried where God has promised, then because as Jesus tells us in the Gospels, because God, the God of Jacob, is the God of the living, then God's going to raise Jacob from the dead. That body that is buried will be raised.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And that obviously, I think that does have some bearing on modern funeral practice as well. I mean, I think probably our listeners' minds are going there too, and maybe asking some of those questions. But, what we do with a body after that person dies does make a confession, whether good or ill. It says something whenever we do that.
Yeah, and certainly what Jacob says here makes a confession, and not only what he says, but the way in which he says it. This isn't Joseph, or this is not Jacob saying to his son Joseph, "Hey, I've got a suggestion for you. Here I was thinking about this. Maybe just kind of keep it in mind." He makes him swear an oath here in a pretty serious way.
Yeah, he does. Yeah, it is. They swear to me that you'll do this. Yeah, and he has him put the hand under the thigh and everything, which is an ancient symbol that I think is bizarre today. But that's what they did then. And this is a promise that he made, and Joseph agreed to it and said, "Yeah, I'll do that for you, Dad. I'll make sure that that's what happens." So yeah, you're absolutely right. This is a binding thing. It's not just a suggestion, not just a request. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, and it's the same thing we saw Abraham have his servant do when Abraham sent that servant to find a wife for Isaac. Which again, I think the fact that you see that same gesture, which you said is an odd one to us today, but it's the same gesture repeated twice. Both of those contexts are this matter of the Lord's promise. Isaac had to have a wife because the promise needed to continue through the chosen son. Jacob needs to be buried because God has made a promise, and that matter of the seriousness with which they take the promise of God certainly comes through here. For all the times in his life that Jacob doubted the Lord's promise or acted in ways that did not confess his faith, here I think at the end of his life you do see the faith that he has, and rightly is the Lord is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob indeed is this faithful patriarch we see here at the end. What about the very last phrase of the chapter? Israel bowed himself upon the head of his bed or upon his staff, as some texts say. What's happening there?
Yeah, I'm going to admit I didn't think about that much, but could just be that he is obviously he's near death, and so the bowing of his head there could just be something that where he's running out of energy.
Yeah.
Could be something as simple as that. But also, what are we typically doing when we talk about bowing our head? We're talking about praying. So
Sure.
It could be him praying as well in this particular instance. But
Yeah.
I think too though it happens after beginning of verse 31, and Jacob said, "Swear to me," and Joseph swore to him, and so Israel then bowed himself upon the head of his bed. So that could just be a matter of relief that he's received the promise that he desired from his son as well here.
Yeah. So Joseph agrees. The faith of his father has been passed on to him, and they will, as we will see later in the book of Genesis, they will make good on the promise made. Jacob will be buried in the promised land, just as he desires. And we've got about 2.5 minutes here. Pastor Vandercook, as we wrap things up on this text, what do we take from it as Christians? How does it point us to our Lord Jesus?
You know, I was thinking a little bit about the third petition of the Lord's Prayer here, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. You know, and as we have in the Catechism, we confess there that the good and gracious will of God is done even without our prayer. Basically, the will of God is going to happen. You can't make it happen, and you also can't prevent it from happening. But nonetheless, what we see here is the unfolding of the will of God and the way in which he brings it about in multiple different ways. First of all, in the fact that what does God will when it comes to his people? Well, he wants them to survive. He wants them to survive Egypt. Well, first of all, he brings them into Egypt so they do survive, but then he wants them to survive Egypt and return back to the promised land, and he wants them to remain faithful through all of this. That part becomes a little bit of a struggle in the future, obviously, as you know, you read through the book of Exodus and so on through the Old Testament. But nonetheless, we see Joseph's role in all of this, in that the will of God is that his people be preserved, and the instrument that he uses to make this happen is Joseph. And likewise, what is the will of God when it comes to our salvation, and how is that confessed here at the end of this section with Jacob? Well, you know, Jacob is desiring to be buried with his fathers in what will be the nation of Israel, the promised land. And, you know, again, what's the instrument that God uses to see to it that his promise that Jacob returned to Israel here? Well, it's Joseph again. So we see how Joseph is used by the Lord in order to carry out his will among his people. And so we see the Lord working through means to see to it that his will is done.
Pastor David Vandercook serves at Bethlehem Evangelical Lutheran Church in Crawford, Nebraska, and Redeemer Evangelical Lutheran Church in Harrison, Nebraska. He's been helping us today to study Genesis chapter 47, verses 13 to 31. Pastor Vandercook, thanks for being our guest today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I am your host here on Sharper Iron, Pastor Timothy Appel of Faith Lutheran Church in Godfrey, Illinois. If you have any questions about this section of Genesis, send an email to kfuo@kfuo.org. It is always a joy to hear from you. Join us again next week as we continue to read in the book of Genesis. On Monday, we will be in chapter 48 to hear about some of the things that Jacob did before he died, including blessing the two sons of Joseph. Thanks for spending the morning with us today. Talk with you again next week.
Showing support for KFUO is now easier than ever. You can sport a KFUO shirt, swag, or even socks by visiting our online store. Go to kfuo.org/store and order high-quality KFUO-branded merch. You no longer need to wait for our annual share-a-thon for a chance to show your KFUO spirit. Visually share and wear this ministry out in the world by checking out our selection. Every purchase helps to support our proclamation of Christ for you, anytime, anywhere. Go to kfuo.org/store.